Chapter 15, The Battle of Omdurman. September 2, 1898. The bugles all over the camp by the river began to sound at 4:30. The cavalry trumpets and the drums and fifes of the British division joined the chorus, and everyone awoke amid a confusion of merry or defiant notes. Then it grew gradually lighter, and the cavalry mounted their horses, the infantry stood to their arms, and the gunners went to their batteries, while the sun, rising over the Nile, revealed the wide plain, the dark rocky hills, and the waiting army. It was as if all the preliminaries were settled, the ground cleared, and nothing remained but the final act, and the rigor of the game. Even before it became light, several squadrons of British and Egyptian cavalry were pushed swiftly forward to gain contact with the enemy and learn his intentions. The first of these, under Captain Baring, occupied Surgham Hill, and waited in the gloom until the whereabouts of the dervishes should be disclosed by the dawn. It was a perilous undertaking, for he might have found them unexpectedly near. As the sun rose, the 21st Lancers trotted out of the zareba, and threw out a spray of officers' patrols. As there had been no night attack, it was expected that the dervish army would have retired to their original position, or entered the town. It was hardly conceivable that they would advance across the open ground to attack the zareba by daylight. Indeed, it appeared more probable that their hearts had failed them in the night, and that they had melted away into the desert. But these anticipations were immediately dispelled by the scene, which was visible from the crest of the ridge. It was 5:45. The light was dim, but growing stronger every minute. There in the plain lay the enemy, their numbers unaltered, their confidence and intentions apparently unshaken. Their front was now nearly 5 miles long, and composed of great masses of men joined together by thinner lines. Behind and near to the flanks were large reserves. From the ridge they looked dark blurs and streaks, relieved and diversified with an odd-looking shimmer of light from the spear points. At about 6:10 it was evident that the masses were in motion and advancing swiftly. Their emirs galloped about and before their ranks. Scouts and patrols scattered themselves all over the front. Then they began to cheer. They were still a mile away from the hill, and were concealed from the Sirdar's army by the folds of the ground. The noise of the shouting was heard, albeit faintly, by the troops down by the river. But to those watching on the hill a tremendous roar came up in waves of intense sound, like the tumult of the rising wind and sea before a storm. The British and Egyptian forces were arranged in line, with their back to the river. The flanks were secured by the gunboats lying moored in the stream. Before them was the rolling sandy plain, looking from the slight elevation of the ridge smooth and flat as a table. To the right rose the rocky hills of the Kareri position, near which the Egyptian cavalry were drawn up, a dark solid mass of men and horses. On the left the 21st Lancers, with a single squadron thrown out in advance, were halted watching their patrols, who climbed about Surgham Hill, stretched forward beyond it, or perched, as we did, on the ridge. The ground sloped gently up from the river, so that it seemed as if the landward ends of the Surgham and Kareri ridges curved in towards each other, enclosing what lay between. Beyond the long swell of sand which formed the western wall of this spacious amphitheatre, the black shapes of the distant hills rose in misty confusion. The challengers were already in the arena, their antagonists swiftly approached. Although the dervishes were steadily advancing, a belief that their musketry was inferior encouraged a nearer view, and we trotted round the southwest slopes of Surgham Hill until we reached the sand hills on the enemy's side, among which the regiment had waited the day before. Thence the whole array was visible in minute detail. It seemed that every single man of all the thousands could be examined separately. The pace of their march was fast and steady, and it was evident that it would not be safe to wait long among the sand hills. Yet the wonder of the scene exercised a dangerous fascination, and for a while we tarried. The emblems of the more famous emirs were easily distinguishable. On the extreme left, the chiefs and soldiers of the bright green flag gathered under Ali Wad Helu. Between this and the center, the large dark green flag of Osman Sheikh ed-Din rose above a dense mass of spearmen, preceded by long lines of warriors armed presumably with rifles. Over the center, commanded by Yaqub, the sacred black banner of the Khalifa floated high and remarkable, while on the right a great square of dervishes was arrayed under an extraordinary number of white flags, amid which the red ensign of Sharif was almost hidden. All the pride and might of the Dervish Empire were massed on this last great day of its existence. Riflemen who had helped to destroy Hicks, spearmen who had charged at Abu Klea, emirs who saw the sack of Gondar, Bagara fresh from raiding the Shiluks, warriors who had besieged Khartoum or marched, inspired by the memories of former triumphs and embittered by the knowledge of late defeats, to chastise the impudent and accursed invaders. The advance continued. The dervish left began to stretch out across the plain towards Kareri, as I thought, to turn our right flank. Their center, under the black flag, moved directly towards Surgham. The right pursued a line of advance south of that hill. This mass of men were the most striking of all. They could not have mustered fewer than 6,000. Their array was perfect. They displayed a great number of flags, perhaps 500, which looked at the distance white, though they were really covered with texts from the Quran, and which by their admirable alignment made this division of the Khalifa's army look like the old representations of the Crusaders in the Bayeux tapestry. The attack developed. The left, nearly 20,000 strong, toiled across the plain and approached the Egyptian squadrons. The leading masses of the center deployed facing the Zariba, and marched forthwith to the direct assault. As the whole dervish army continued to advance, the division with the white flags, which had until now been echeloned in rear of their right, moved up into the general line and began to climb the southern slopes of Surgham Hill. Meanwhile, yet another body of the enemy, comparatively insignificant in numbers, who had been drawn up behind the white flags, were moving slowly towards the Nile, echeloned still further behind their right, and not far from the suburbs of Omdurman. These men had evidently been posted to prevent the dervish army being cut off from the city, and to secure their line of retreat, and with them the 21st Lancers were destined to have a much closer acquaintance about 2 hours later. The dervish center had come within range. But it was not the British and Egyptian army that began the battle. If there was one arm in which the Arabs were beyond all comparison inferior to their adversaries, it was in guns. Yet it was with this arm that they opened their attack. In the middle of the dervish line, now marching in frontal assault, were 2 puffs of smoke. About 50 yards short of the thorn fence, 2 red clouds of sand and dust sprang up, where the projectiles had struck. It looked like a challenge. It was immediately answered. Great clouds of smoke appeared all along the front of the British and Sudanese brigades. One after another 4 batteries opened on the enemy at a range of about 3,000 yards. The sound of the cannonade rolled up to us on the ridge, and was re-echoed by the hills. Above the heads of the moving masses, shells began to burst, dotting the air with smoke balls and the ground with bodies. But a nearer tragedy impended. The white flags were nearly over the crest. In another minute they would become visible to the batteries. Did they realize what would come to meet them? They were in a dense mass, 2,800 yards from the 32nd Field Battery and the gunboats. The ranges were known. It was a matter of machinery. The more distant slaughter passed unnoticed, as the mind was fascinated by the approaching horror. In a few seconds swift destruction would rush on these brave men. They topped the crest and drew out into full view of the whole army. Their white banners made them conspicuous above all. As they saw the camp of their enemies, they discharged their rifles with a great roar of musketry and quickened their pace. For a moment the white flags advanced in regular order, and the whole division crossed the crest and were exposed. Forthwith the gunboats, the 32nd British Field Battery, and other guns from the zareba opened on them. About 20 shells struck them in the first minute. Some burst high in the air, others exactly in their faces. Others, again, plunged into the sand and, exploding, dashed clouds of red dust, splinters, and bullets amid their ranks. The white banners toppled over in all directions. Yet they rose again immediately, as other men pressed forward to die for the Mahdi's sacred cause, and in the defense of the successor of the true prophet. It was a terrible sight, for as yet they had not hurt us at all, and it seemed an unfair advantage to strike thus cruelly when they could not reply. Under the influence of the shells, the mass of the white flags dissolved into thin lines of spearmen and skirmishers, and came on in altered formation and diminished numbers, but with unabated enthusiasm. And now, the whole attack being thoroughly exposed, it became the duty of the cavalry to clear the front as quickly as possible, and leave the further conduct of the debate to the infantry and the Maxim guns. All the patrols trotted or cantered back to their squadrons, and the regiment retired swiftly into the zareba, while the shells from the gunboats screamed overhead, and the whole length of the position began to burst into flame and smoke. Nor was it long before the tremendous banging of the artillery was swollen by the roar of musketry. Taking advantage of the shelter of the riverbank, the cavalry dismounted, we watered our horses, waited, and wondered what was happening. And every moment the tumult grew louder and more intense, until even the flickering stutter of the Maxims could scarcely be heard above the continuous din 80 yards away, and perhaps 20 feet above us. The 32nd Field Battery was in action. The nimble figures of the gunners darted about as they busied themselves in their complicated process of destruction. The officers, some standing on biscuit boxes, peered through their glasses and studied the effect. Of this I had one glimpse. 800 yards away a ragged line of men were coming on desperately, struggling forward in the face of the pitiless fire, white banners tossing and collapsing, white figures subsiding in dozens to the ground, little white puffs from their rifles, larger white puffs spreading in a row all along their front from the bursting shrapnel. The infantry fired steadily and stolidly, without hurry or excitement, for the enemy were far away and the officers careful. Besides, the soldiers were interested in the work and took great pains. But presently the mere physical act became tedious. The tiny figures seen over the slide of the backsight seemed a little larger, but also fewer at each successive volley. The rifles grew hot, so hot that they had to be changed for those of the reserve companies. The Maxim guns exhausted all the water in their jackets, and several had to be refreshed from the water bottles of the Cameron Highlanders before they could go on with their deadly work. The empty cartridge cases, tinkling to the ground, formed a small but growing heap beside each man. And all the time out on the plain on the other side bullets were shearing through flesh, smashing and splintering bone, blood spouted from terrible wounds. Valiant men were struggling on through a hell of whistling metal, exploding shells, and spurting dust, suffering, despairing, dying. Such was the first phase of the Battle of Omdurman. The Khalifa's plan of attack appears to have been complex and ingenious. It was, however, based on an extraordinary miscalculation of the power of modern weapons. With the exception of this cardinal error, it is not necessary to criticize it. He first ordered about 15,000 men, drawn chiefly from the army of Osman Sheikh ed-Din, and placed under the command of Osman Azrak, to deliver a frontal attack. He himself waited with an equal force near Surgham Hill to watch the result. If it succeeded, he would move forward with his bodyguard, the flower of the Arab army, and complete the victory. If it failed, there was yet another chance. The dervishes who were first launched against the zareba, although very brave men, were not by any means his best or most reliable troops. Their destruction might be a heavy loss, but it would not end the struggle. While the attack was proceeding, the valiant left, consisting of the rest of the army of Osman Sheikh ed-Din, might move unnoticed to the northern flank and curve round on to the front of the zareba held by the Egyptian brigade. Ali Wad Helu was meanwhile to march to the Kareri Hills, and remain out of range, and if possible, out of sight among them. Should the frontal and flank attacks be unhappily repulsed, the enemies of God, exulting in their easy victory over the faithful, would leave their strong place and march to the capture and sack of the city. Then, while they were yet dispersed on the plain, with no Zariba to protect them, the chosen warriors of the true religion would abandon all concealment, and hasten in their thousands to the utter destruction of the accursed the Khalifa, with 15,000 falling upon them from behind Surghum, Ali Wad Helu, and all that remained of Osman's army assailing them from Kareri. Attacked at once from the north and south, and encompassed on every side, the infidels would abandon hope and order, and Kitchener might share the fate of Hicks and Gordon. Two circumstances, which will appear as the account proceeds, prevented the accomplishment of this plan. The second attack was not executed simultaneously by the two divisions of the Dervish army, and even had it been, the power of the musketry would have triumphed, and though the expeditionary force might have sustained heavier losses, the main result could not have been affected. The last hopes of barbarism had passed with the shades of night. Colonel Broadwood, with 9 squadrons of cavalry, the Camel Corps, and the horse artillery, had been ordered to check the Dervish left, and prevent it enveloping the downstream flank of the Zariba, as this was held by the Egyptian brigade, which it was not thought desirable to expose to the full weight of an attack. With this object, as the Dervishes approached, he had occupied the Kareri Ridge with the horse battery and the Camel Corps, holding his cavalry in reserve in rear of the center. The Kareri Ridge, to which reference has so frequently been made, consists of 2 main features, which rise to the height of about 300 feet above the plain, are each above a mile long, and run nearly east and west, with a dip or trough about 1,000 yards wide between them. The eastern ends of these main ridges are perhaps 1,000 yards from the river, and in this intervening space there are several rocky underfeatures and knolls. The Kareri Hills, the spaces between them, and the smaller features are covered with rough boulders and angular stones of volcanic origin, which render the movements of horses and camels difficult and painful. The cavalry horses and camels were in the dip between the 2 ridges, and the dismounted men of the Camel Corps were deployed along the crest of the most southerly of the ridges, with their right at the desert end. Next in order to the Camel Corps, the center of the ridge was occupied by the dismounted cavalry. The horse artillery were on the left. The remainder of the cavalry waited in the hollow behind the guns. The tempestuous advance of Osman soon brought him into contact with the mounted force. His real intentions are still a matter of conjecture. Whether he had been ordered to attack the Egyptian brigade, or to drive back the cavalry, or to disappear behind the Kareri Hills in conformity with Ali Wad Helu, is impossible to pronounce. His action was, however, clear. He could not safely assail the Egyptians, with a powerful cavalry force threatening his left rear. He therefore continued his move across the front of the Zariba. Keeping out of the range of infantry fire, bringing up his right, and marching along due north, he fell upon Broadwood. This officer, who had expected to have to deal with small bodies on the Dervish flank, found himself suddenly exposed to the attack of nearly 15,000 men, many of whom were riflemen. The Sirdar, seeing the situation from the Zariba, sent him an order to withdraw within the lines of infantry. Colonel Broadwood, however, preferred to retire through the Kareri Hills to the northward, drawing Osman after him. He replied to that effect. The first position had soon to be abandoned. The Dervishes, advancing in a northeasterly direction, attacked the Kareri Hills obliquely. They immediately enveloped the right flank of the mounted troops holding them. It will be seen from the map that as soon as the Dervish riflemen gained a point west and in prolongation of the trough between the 2 ridges, they not only turned the right flank, but also threatened the retreat of the defenders of the southerly ridge, for they were able to sweep the trough from end to end with their fire. As soon as it became certain that the southerly ridge could not be held any longer, Colonel Broadwood retired the battery to the east end of the second or northern ridge. This was scarcely accomplished when the dip was enfiladed, and the cavalry and camel corps, who followed, lost about 50 men, and many horses and camels killed and wounded. The camel corps were the most unfortunate. They were soon encumbered with wounded, and it was now painfully evident that in rocky ground the dervishes could go faster on their feet than the soldiers on their camels. Pressing on impetuously at a pace of nearly 7 miles an hour, and unchecked by a heavy artillery fire from the zareba, and a less effective fire from the horse battery, which was only armed with 7-pounder Krupps of an obsolete pattern, the Arabs rapidly diminished the distance between themselves and their enemies. In these circumstances, Colonel Broadwood decided to send the camel corps back to the zareba under cover of a gunboat, which, watchfully observing the progress of the fight, was coming downstream to assist. The distance which divided the combatants was scarcely 400 yards and decreasing every minute. The cavalry were drawn up across the eastern or river end of the trough. The guns of the horse battery fired steadily from their new position on the northern ridge. But the camel corps were still struggling in the broken ground, and it was clear that their position was one of great peril. The dervishes already carpeted the rocks of the southern ridge with dull yellow swarms, and, heedless of the shells which still assailed them in reverse from the zareba, continued to push their attack home. On the very instant that they saw the camel corps make for the river, they realized that those they had deemed their prey were trying, like a hunted animal, to run to ground within the lines of infantry. With that instinctive knowledge of war which is the heritage of savage peoples, the whole attack swung to the right, changed direction from north to east, and rushed down the trough and along the southern ridge towards the Nile, with the plain intention of cutting off the camel corps and driving them into the river. The moment was critical. It appeared to the cavalry commander that the dervishes would actually succeed, and their success must involve the total destruction of the camel corps. That could not, of course, be tolerated. The whole 9 squadrons of cavalry assumed a preparatory formation. The British officers believed that a terrible charge impended. They would meet in direct collision the swarms of men who were hurrying down the trough. The diversion might enable the camel corps to escape. But the ground was bad, the enemy's force was overwhelming, the Egyptian troopers were prepared to obey, but that was all. There was no exalted enthusiasm, such as at these moments carries sterner breeds to victory. Few would return. Nevertheless, the operation appeared inevitable. The camel corps were already close to the river. But thousands of dervishes were running swiftly towards them at right angles to their line of retreat, and it was certain that if the cavalry attempted to cross this new front of the enemy, they would be annihilated. Their only hope lay in maintaining themselves by their fire near the riverbank until help could reach them, and in order to delay and weaken the dervish attack, the cavalry would have to make a desperate charge. But at the critical moment the gunboat arrived on the scene and began suddenly to blaze and flame from Maxim guns, quick-firing guns, and rifles. The range was short, the effect tremendous. The terrible machine, floating gracefully on the waters, a beautiful white devil, wreathed itself in smoke. The river slopes of the Kareri Hills, crowded with the advancing thousands, sprang up into clouds of dust and splinters of rock. The charging dervishes sank down in tangled heaps. The masses in rear paused, irresolute. It was too hot even for them. The approach of another gunboat completed their discomfiture. The camel corps, hurrying along the shore, slipped past the fatal point of interception, and saw safety and the zareba before them. Exasperated by their disappointment, the soldiers of Osman Sheikh ed-Din turned again upon the cavalry, and, forgetting in their anger the mobile nature of their foe, pursued the elusive squadrons 3 long miles to the north. The cavalry, intensely relieved by the escape of the camel corps, played with their powerful antagonist, as the banderillo teases the bull. Colonel Broadwood thus succeeded in luring this division of the dervish army far away from the field of battle, where they were sorely needed. The rough ground, however, delayed the horse battery. They lagged, as the camel corps had done, and caused constant anxiety. At length 2 of their guns stuck fast in a marshy spot, and as several men and horses were shot in the attempt to extricate them, Broadwood wisely ordered them to be abandoned, and they were soon engulfed in the dervish masses. Encouraged by this capture, the horsemen of Osman's command daringly attacked the retreating cavalry. But they were effectually checked by the charge of a squadron under Major Mahon. Both gunboats, having watched the camel corps safely into the Zariba, now returned with the current and renewed their attack upon the Arabs. Opening a heavy and accurate fire upon the river flank, they drove them westward and away from the Nile. Through the gap thus opened, Broadwood and his squadrons trotted to rejoin the main body, picking up on the way the 2 guns which had been abandoned. While these things were passing on the northern flank, the frontal attack was in progress. The debris of the white flags joined the center, and the whole 14,000 pressed forward against the Zariba, spreading out by degrees and abandoning their dense formations, and gradually slowing down. At about 800 yards from the British division the advance ceased, and they could make no headway. Opposite the Sudanese, who were armed only with the Martini Henry rifle, the assailants came within 300 yards, and one brave old man, carrying a flag, fell at 150 paces from the shelter trench. But the result was conclusive all along the line. The attack was shattered. The leader, clad in his new jibber of many colors, rode on steadfastly towards the inexorable firing line, until, pierced by several bullets, he fell lifeless. Such was the end of that stubborn warrior of many fights, wicked Osman Azrak, faithful unto death. The surviving dervishes lay down on the ground. Unable to advance, they were unwilling to retire, and their riflemen, taking advantage of the folds of the plain, opened and maintained an unequal combat. By 8 o'clock it was evident that the whole attack had failed. The loss of the enemy was more than 2,000 killed, and perhaps as many wounded. To the infantry, who were busy with their rifles, it had scarcely seemed a fight. Yet all along the front bullets had whizzed over and into the ranks, and in every battalion there were casualties. Captain Caldecott, of the Warwicks, was killed. The Camerons had 2 officers, Captain Clark and Lieutenant Nicholson, severely wounded, the Grenadiers 1, Captain Baggett. Colonel F. Rhodes, as he sat on his horse near the Maxim battery of the 1st British Brigade, was shot through the shoulder and carried from the field just as the attack reached its climax. There were, besides these officers, about 150 casualties among the soldiers. The attack languished. The enemy's rifle fire continued, and as soon as the heavy firing ceased it began to be annoying. The ground, although it appeared flat and level to the eye, nevertheless contained depressions and swellings which afforded good cover to the sharpshooters, and the solid line behind the Zariba was an easy target. The artillery now began to clear out these depressions by their shells, and in this work they displayed a searching power very remarkable when their flat trajectory is remembered. As the shells burst accurately above the dervish skirmishers and spearmen who were taking refuge in the folds of the plain, they rose by hundreds and by 50s to fly. Instantly the hungry and attentive Maxims and the watchful infantry opened on them, sweeping them all to the ground, some in death, others in terror. Again the shells followed them to their new concealment. Again they rose, fewer than before, and ran. Again the Maxims and the rifles spluttered. Again they fell. And so on until the front of the Zariba was clear of unwounded men for at least half a mile. A few escaped. Some, notwithstanding the vices of which they have been accused and the perils with which they were encompassed, gloriously carried off their injured comrades. After the attack had been broken, and while the front of the Zariba was being cleared of the dervish riflemen, the 21st Lancers were again called upon to act. The Sirdar and his generals were all agreed on one point. They must occupy Omdurman before the dervish army could get back there. They could fight as many dervishes as cared to come in the plain. Among the houses it was different. As the Khalifa had anticipated, the infidels, exulting in their victory, were eager, though for a different reason, to seize the city. And this they were now in a position to do. The Arabs were out in the desert. A great part of their army was even as far away as Kareri. The troops could move on interior lines. They were bound to reach Omdurman first. The order was therefore given to march on the city at once. But first the Surgham ridge must be reconnoitred, and the ground between the Zeriba and Omdurman cleared of the dervishes with infantry if necessary, but with cavalry if possible, because that would be quicker. As the fusillade slackened, the lancers stood to their horses. Then General Gattaca, with Captain Brooke and the rest of his staff, came galloping along the rear of the line of infantry and guns, and shouted for Colonel Martin. There was a brief conversation, an outstretched arm pointing at the ridge in order, and we were all scrambling into our saddles and straightening the ranks in high expectation. We started at a trot, 2 or 3 patrols galloping out in front, towards the high ground, while the regiment followed in mass. A great square block of ungainly brown figures and little horses, hung all over with water bottles, saddlebags, picketing gear, tins of bulla beef, all jolting and jangling together, the polish of peace gone, soldiers without glitter, horsemen without grace, but still a regiment of light cavalry in active operation against the enemy. The crest of the ridge was only half a mile away. It was found unoccupied. The rocky mass of Surgham obstructed the view and concealed the great reserve collected around the Black Flag. But southward, between us and Omdurman, the whole plain was exposed. It was infested with small parties of dervishes, moving about, mounted and on foot, in 10s and 20s. 3 miles away a broad stream of fugitives, of wounded, and of deserters flowed from the Khalifa's army to the city. The mirages blurred and distorted the picture, so that some of the routed Arabs walked in air and some through water, and all were misty and unreal. But the sight was sufficient to excite the fiercest instincts of cavalry. Only the scattered parties in the plain appeared to prevent a glorious pursuit. The signaling officer was set to heliograph back to the Sirdar that the ridge was unoccupied, and that several thousand dervishes could be seen flying into Omdurman. Pending the answer, we waited, and looking back northwards, across the front of the Zeriba, where the first attack had been stopped, perceived a greyish-white smudge, perhaps a mile long. The glass disclosed details: hundreds of tiny white figures heaped or scattered, dozens hopping, crawling, staggering away, a few horses standing stolidly among the corpses, a few unwounded men dragging off their comrades. The skirmishers among the rocks of Surgham soon began to fire at the regiment, and we sheltered among the mounds of sand, while a couple of troops replied with their carbines. Then the heliograph in the Zeriba began to talk in flashes of light that opened and shut capriciously. The actual order is important. Advance, said the Alio, and clear the left flank, and use every effort to prevent the enemy re-entering Omdurman. That was all, but it was sufficient. In the distance the enemy could be seen re-entering Omdurman in hundreds. There was no room for doubt. They must be stopped, and incidentally these small parties in the plain might be brushed away. We remounted, the ground looked smooth and unbroken, yet it was desirable to reconnoiter. 2 patrols were sent out. The small parties of dervishes, who were scattered all over the plain and the slopes of the hill, prevented anything less than a squadron moving, except at their peril. The first patrol struck out towards Omdurman, and began to push in between the scattered dervishes, who fired their rifles and showed great excitement. The other patrol, under Lieutenant Grenfell, was sent to see what the ground looked like from further along the ridge, and on the lower slopes of Surgham. The riflemen among the rocks turned their fire from the regiment to these nearer objects. The 5 brown figures cantered over the rough ground, presenting difficult targets, but under continual fire, and disappeared round the spur. However, in 2 or 3 minutes they reappeared, the riflemen on the hill making a regular rattle of musketry, amid which the lancers galloped safely back, followed last of all by their officer. He said that the plain looked as safe from the other side of the hill as from where we were. At this moment the other patrol returned. They, too, had had good fortune in their adventurous ride. Their information was exact. They reported that in a shallow and apparently practicable khor about 3/4 of a mile to the southwest, and between the regiment and the fugitives, there was drawn up a formed body of dervishes about 1,000 strong. Colonel Martin decided on this information to advance and attack this force, which alone interposed between him and the Arab line of retreat. Then we started. But all this time the enemy had been busy. At the beginning of the battle the Khalifa had posted a small force of 700 men on his extreme right, to prevent his line of retreat to Omdurman being harassed. This detachment was composed entirely of the Hadendoa tribesmen of Osman Digna's flag, and was commanded by one of his subordinate emirs, who selected a suitable position in the shallow khor. As soon as the 21st Lancers left the Zariba, the dervish scouts on the top of Surgham carried the news to the Khalifa. It was said that the English cavalry were coming to cut him off from Omdurman.